Okay. Roland Hulme, thank you very, very much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me, because I'm actually thrilled. I'm really excited to chat to you because we've been batting some messages back and forth, and I'm super excited about your experience of coming to America because it makes me feel nostalgic for my experience coming to America. So yeah, I'm really excited to chat to you.
Thank you very much. And yes, we're both Brits living in America, right? That's the start of this. That's who we are.
Absolutely. And I
and
mean,
that
I've been here for 20 years, but I still have the accent because that's my only marketable
Oh,
skill.
that makes me feel better. I was worried I'd be losing mine. Okay, 20 years. Wow. And you're on the East Coast, I'm on the West, right? So we've got a bit of a time difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's still, oh, you've still got the whole day to go here, where it's I'm wrapping things up. I live in New Jersey, but I tell all my friends outside of America that I live in New York. But I'm 40 minutes away by train. I used to commute to the city and stuff like that. But so New Jersey people consider themselves kind of New York, even though New York people don't consider New Jersey people New Yorkers.
Okay. Interesting setup.
It's very, very complex.
And you've lived in New Jersey for what, 20 years? You've been there?
No, so I first came to America in 2001, in November 2001, and I lived on Long Island, and I was working for the American University of Paris. And so I would spend about 8 months in America recruiting students and faculty for this summer program that they ran in Paris. And then I would go to Paris and run the program and then and things. So I was based on Long Island, which was amazing. And then I would go every summer to Paris, which is, there are other places to be forced to go.
Yeah. Oh, how lovely.
Every summer. My wife there, she was a waitress at TGI Fridays. And we hit it off. She came to live with me in England for a bit, but from about 2001 to 2004, I went back and forth. And then in 2007, we moved out full to
Interesting,
America.
our dates match up. I went to Turkish Cyprus in 2001 as well.
Oh, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Isn't that funny? I always think,
That's
in
when my
Doctor
travelling
Who, they always have these years that are like fixed points in time. And I always think 2001 is one of those years where so many people, such big things happen to them.
Yes. For me, it's 1977. You've got Star Wars coming out, The Spy Who Loved Me coming out, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy coming out, A Bridge Too Far coming out. I'm like, you were saturated for media in just that 1 year.
It's funny, and you speak my language and you do that. My son is reading the whole Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series right now, and I love that because it's, I grew up on those books and they meant such a lot to me, and then he's reading them and it's so fun to be able to like share that experience. And Star Wars, I was the biggest Star Wars fan when I was a kid. My brother and I used to, beat each other with rolled up rolled up wrapping paper tubes and stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a very, very big part of my life. In fact, that was the one thing I was desperate to see if ever I came to America, was the redwood trees, because it's Endor and Return of the Jedi. That's why I went. That was genuine life ambition from when I was a tiny tot.
And did they live up to expectations?
To be honest, they exceeded them. I think there's so few things in life that look better in real life than they do on screen. And I just really couldn't believe it. I mean, yeah, it was one of the very few things that's so much better in real life. So I'd recommend it to anybody, even if you're not a Star Wars fan. Just as a life experience, seeing the redwoods is genuinely striking.
And it's funny because the geography out in California is very different. I mean, New Jersey, to be honest, apart from the seasons being a little hotter and colder, it's very much like England to a certain extent. It's not that different. Whereas I've been to San Francisco and it's beautiful, and everything seems very, very different. And then I was in Utah and Wyoming and stuff like that. And Utah is just like blew my mind. I'd never seen anything like it.
Yeah, it's amazing the variety of landscapes we have here in America, right?
Yeah, and this huge nation, and it's funny. I think America is almost like the European Union. It's actually we all speak the same language and we all use the same currency, but really, different states are like different countries.
Oh yes, I've even noticed. Just as as a foreigner being here, Southern California seems so different from Northern California. It's
absolutely. Now, because when I went to Northern California, I went to San Francisco, I was amazed. Because New York is a pretty liberal place, and then everyone in San Francisco is like a step beyond that. But I hear Southern California is a little more sort of conservative and cowboyish.
Yes. I've noticed that because I was expecting liberal California, and I've noticed a lot more just conservative viewpoints here than I necessarily expected. Yeah, I've heard that they've even thought of separating North and South California, or California separating from the rest of America. It seems to be an ongoing debate here, but a permanent one.
I think there are people who want to saw Florida, so it just floats off as part of America. But
Not sure if the people living in Florida or the people living in the rest of America want to do that.
so, what was the biggest culture shock for you when you first arrived in America?
Oh, I feel I'm still going through this. I feel like I've had the holiday time. You arrive and everything's new and interesting, and it's time for it all to settle in. So I've only been here for a short time. So I'm not sure if I've fully experienced the culture shock that I might later have. Of course, I'm coming from China. Even though I am British, I'm very used to, you know, shared public spaces, whereas in America, people have their own individual space. Like everyone drives instead of taking the metro, or you don't have those big public parks that China has. People have their own backyards.
That's a really interesting observation. I was in India last year and it was kind of the same thing. It's like there were just people everywhere, and then people lived on top of people and they seemed to be okay with it. Whereas I think in
Yeah.
England you have you have your boarded up little backyard, and in America it's where I live in America, everyone has like their own individual houses. So yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I hesitate to mention it because I know it's everywhere, but obviously 2020 was the year of the virus, and I was in China, and it was interesting to see how national stereotypes come in. With China, it's just, lock down entire cities, increase surveillance of all the population, and that's okay. That's we all went along with it because that's life. Here, it seems to be more about individual rights. Whilst following from the UK, it's all about fairness. So it seems to bring out the national stereotypes that already exist, and we're just applying them to this new situation.
It's funny, and in some ways, it brings out the worst of them. I was thinking in Australia, where they have like entire tower blocks locked down for 14
Yeah.
days and stuff, and I'm like, whereas in America, it's we did the best we can. I think people, if there were going to be Americans who are compliant, they would be in New York, and I think we were pretty good. But I think you wouldn't get away with the lockdowns and the things like that
No,
you have in England or anywhere else.
no, exactly. And as I say, in China, it was very, very strict. But everyone kind of followed through with that. We just changed our companies, changed everything around that. That's the rule we follow. So I think there's a very, very different perspective. But again, it's one that plays into our culture and what we're willing to. I'd say the biggest scandal in the UK seems to be over what's fair. Is it one rule for the government and one rule for everyone else? Fairness has been a big part of that.
That is very British, isn't it?
It is. It is.
My sister was telling me it's like, oh, they're in tier one, but we're in tier two. So it's okay. So we can have one pod that's mixed with another pod. And I'm like, whoa, I've been in America too long. Do we wear masks or not? That's about as sophisticated as we get. Like anything more than that, it's too complicated. I'm not doing it.
I do also like that strata of, well, we're in tier one, they're in tier two, and it's like,
Yeah.
are we lower middle class, are we middle class, are we upper middle class? Where do we all lie? And once we know, we're happy, but we need to know.
There was a wonderful sketch. I can't remember. Was it it can't have been the two Ronnies. Maybe it was what they were in before, where they have the three people. It's like, I'm middle class and I look up to him and I look down to you.
Yeah,
And that's such a British thing.
it is, and it's interesting because we have such social mobility in the UK now, but it's something we very much cling to as a structure, right? So,
And I find America is very egalitarian to a certain extent. I mean, I think you don't. I think in England you'd meet somebody and you'd speak to them and you'd be like, oh, you'd be like, okay, this person looks down at me. It's never what you think; it's what you think they think. It's
exactly.
they think it's like, oh, I think they look down at me, or I think they have a chip on their shoulder, and it's always this kind of
Mm,
thing. Whereas in America, you meet people who are CEOs who have, will fist bump with the janitor, and I
yeah.
get the feeling that the janitor doesn't feel like they are less worthy or looked down upon for doing it. It's all about, in America, you work your soul
Mm,
away until you
yeah.
die, but there's some kind of egalitarian and spirit thing there.
I feel I've been lucky with the UK in this. I've spent so much time in Yorkshire where they'll look down on you if you're not from Yorkshire.
Yes.
That's the main thing of how Yorkshire are you. In my case, not terribly, but I like it. That counts.
Do you have like the no true Scotsman thing? Because I'm Scottish by I wear a kilt, which I can get away with in America, but everyone in England would be like, well, everyone in Britain would be like, where's your Scottish accent? Where's the? It's like my family come from Inverness, but I admit I'm very, very south.
Yeah, I mean, my family came, I guess, historically from Galway Bay and Ireland, but I've never been to Ireland, so I don't really claim it. I'm not an
I
Irish Englishman or something, you know. It's
I could see you as Irish actually, because with your bright blue eyes and your dark hair, there's yeah. I always say one of the interesting things with the Bond community, and you have the photos and things. There's one cover in particular. I think it's Moonraker, or maybe it's from Russia with Love, where the drawing of James Bond, the painting of James Bond, looks very much like you.
oh, thank you.
And I'm not in America. There's this weird expression of blowing smoke up your ass. I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, but I was like, there's a resemblance there.
Thank you. I think they based it all really on Ian Fleming, what he looked like. So if I have a slightest resemblance to him, I think he's quite slim with a long nose. So I guess I'm helped by slight resemblance. I have no relation to him. But no, definitely don't look like the fellas in the films. But no,
Now, what are you going to do without your bespoke tailors? Now you live in San
I've
Diego.
got almost all the suits I want, so I'm good for the next 10 years. And I have her WeChat, the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp. Um, so we're in touch, and if anything goes wrong with that, we're also on LinkedIn. So she's willing, just about, to make me something in absentia and send it to me. So we'll see. Sometime in the next year if I can.
That's wonderful because I love like you had that wonderful George Lazenby coat with the double-breasted suit with the extra buttons, and I love that one. On a Majesty's
Thank
Secret
you.
Service is my favorite movie. It's my aesthetic, and it's like I don't think you could find anywhere to buy that in America.
No, and that was a very special piece. I had it made, and had it made at the worst possible time for her, which is Chinese New Year. One of the customs is that you must have new clothes for Chinese New Year, so she's inundated. But I would desperately wanted it for that because I was going to see my parents in Turkish Cyprus. So the initial one, it was good. It didn't have all the details, so I asked her, "Could you please do it?" And it was a big ask, as I said. I knew she had a lot on, but she made it perfect, just in time for my flight to see my parents wearing that. And that's obviously one likes to look one's best for my parents, especially as I only see them once a year or even less.
And that's one of the tough things about being an expat, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So although my family is spread out and I'm not the first person to travel, yeah, separation from family is a part of being an expat.
Yeah, I haven't seen my parents since 2015. So they live in France because they retired there, and I went not 2015. Good lord, it was 2015. But it's weird. Yeah, it's such 5 years. It's such a long time, and they're getting on, and it is sad because I get on with my parents and I like my parents.
Same here, same here. And so I'd love to see them more. I'm very lucky. Again, in a 2021 environment, they're able to fly out and spend a month in San Diego. So that for me was a godsend, a genuine godsend. Very, very happy with that. So again, I feel lucky because I got married. So they had to be at the wedding. Of course they did.
And that was lovely. I loved the fact that you live streamed a wedding. That was wonderful. It made
Thank you.
us. I mean, I felt comfortable messaging you because it's kind of like, well, I went to his wedding, didn't I?
Exactly. Again, that's a marvel of the modern world. I'm so happy again sharing with family.
And
Um,
I didn't get drunk or disgrace myself. So,
and neither did I. And I had Vespers.
oh yeah, they can be quite lethal.
Yeah, although I was so busy running around in my own wedding, I was able to take a sip of one Vesper, be pulled away to something else, get another, sip that, and then so I was constantly getting other Vespers, but only having
Well,
slight bits of them.
I have to admit, Vespers are kind of they're really good for about 30 seconds, and then they start to get warm, and then you're like, there's a bit too
Mm, it's quite
much
hard to
burnt
drink
within
them
it.
fast, isn't it?
I have the opposite problem. It's very easy to drink them fast, but then I limit myself these days to every single bad experience I've ever had or interesting experience has normally been preceded by 3 or more martinis.
Okay,
So I'm
fair enough.
like, cut yourself off at that point.
And it's interesting. So we're talking about all these British references, right? So Vesper from Casino Royale, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Both of us obviously feel very much British. Is that
Yeah,
right? Is that a
I
shared thing?
I think that's true. I feel more British living in America than I did in England. I think.
Mm.
Just I enjoy it, and I think I take pride in some of the things that I like about Britain and British culture and stuff. Like it always drives my wife batty because I'm like, well, we have to have the drinks in the right glasses, and we have to have this with the right things. Just these little customs that we bring over, but it's kind of to me, keeping keeping them alive and doing things to a certain extent like that makes me feel like this is the corner of that foreign field that is forever England.
Yes. And that's interesting, isn't it? We keep it alive for ourselves. I was talking to Kane a little while ago, as you know, about kind of things we share as a community. So I think I mentioned Bonfire Night, right? It's coming up.
Yes.
Um, and that's something which is, again, I've lived in different parts of the UK. It's incredibly localized. It's really different, a bit like, say, Harvest Festival, which has just come. It's very, very much dependent on where you are. So I'm wondering, how was it where you were growing up? Did you celebrate these things, and how did you celebrate them?
So I remember when, I mean, I was always traveling around, but for the 4 years that I lived in England with my wife, who was American, we lived in Winchester. We would celebrate bonfire night there, and they'd have the whole city would build this huge bonfire, and you'd burn the guy and stuff like that. It was wonderful. My wife, who is Catholic, she was just like, "Oh my God, is this burn a Catholic night?" And I'm like,
Yes.
"Well, yes, that's one way of putting it that is entirely accurate."
Yeah,
We
and that
prefer to
Catholic
think of
element
it as
is,
nuanced, but
I feel a kind of a north-south divide. I feel on the south coast, for example, it really is an anti-Catholic festival. I guess
yeah.
that memory of the Spanish Armada is still there. Whereas as you go north, I feel it, of course, it's there for historical reasons, but I feel it slowly trickles out the further north you go. And it becomes a general, well, in some cases, people celebrate Guy Fawkes in terms of celebration. They like him.
I mean, I have to admit there have been a few occasions where you're like, you would never ever wish that upon a government, but there were worse governments that it could have happened to.
Exactly. So some people celebrate it a bit like, say, the English Civil War, that there's very different things that even in school, right? So I've been to quite a few schools and I was taught just slightly different angles.
And that is amazing. I remember because I'm a history major, and I remember the history that I studied, the European history, went up to 1769 and then
Mhm.
restarted in 1815.
Right.
And it was very odd. I know. I mean, I think it was a deliberate choice or whatever. And we did the Industrial Revolution and everything like that up to 1769, that specific year. Then it was 1815, and like, oh look, we've had the Napoleonic Wars. Let's talk about the reconstruction of Europe and stuff. And we
That's
never even looked at
extraordinary.
America at all. Yeah,
You know, you skipped the Napoleonic Wars
we skipped the Napoleonic Wars and we skipped the War of American Independence, which was really interesting.
and the War of 1812.
Yes,
You
burning
skipped
down the
that
White
whole.
House.
It's an interesting, exactly. It's an interesting one, and our shelling of Copenhagen, and quite a few things. There's quite a lot that happened. The rise of the Irishman, that is the Duke of Wellington. Um,
I like it. It's
there's a
because I always find whenever I'm hanging out with Canadians, if you ever don't have anything to talk about, you're like, okay, who won the War of 1812?
wow. Yeah, that is interesting. Um, yeah,
It's just some people have different. Oh, and that's an interesting one. But it's also interesting the perspective we have because, of course, living in America, the British are the bad guys.
well, yeah, I've noticed, I was kind of noticed here in California that didn't seem to be the case so much. And someone pointed out to me, well, California kind of grew after all that. On the East Coast, that's very much the case. It's what I'm being told. Again, I'm new here. I don't know. Um, but it does seem to be, yeah, I imagine on the East Coast, especially, say, Boston, that's a very strong dynamic.
Yeah, it's. I remember the advertising agency I used to work in was in Princeton, and then right outside our building was this oak tree that had stood there and was the site of a battle. They have the Princeton battlefields and things, and it's like all
Uh,
of the sites of the American War of Independence are right here. And there's a pub called the Yankee Doodle
yeah.
Tap Room in Princeton, which it has this wonderful Norman Rockwell painting of somebody riding through to tell them that the British are coming, and it's amazing how ingrained it is to everything that's around it. But it's like America is such a huge place. You have different countries, and this is the
Yeah.
history of this state as a country. Whereas in California, yeah, it's completely different.
Oh, absolutely. So here it's all the Spanish history, right? And the fact that this, where I'm living, used to be Mexico. So that, I think that's a
Yes,
big, strong part of the local history here. Yeah, it's quite different.
and that's all to do with like manifest destiny, where they've just
Yeah.
continued to push and push. And it's like this part of Mexico is very nice. It's free real estate.
How British can you get?
So I think I mentioned before we jumped to this call, when I first moved to America, I was part of a website called BritishExpats.com.
Mm.
And I made a friend there who had the same last name as me, who turns out to live in one town over, which is very weird. And I went to dinner with him the other day, and he was talking about his house and his backyard. And he's like, when we moved in, our shed, we found out was 13 inches into the neighbor's property. And we kind of like managed to get away with having it. And I'm like, that's so British of you. You buy a house and immediately you're like usurping parts of your neighbor's territory.
Yeah. It again, there's some nationalities when they travel that really like to blend in and really like to integrate. It seems we don't.
No, I don't know if that's a deliberate thing. I
Hmm.
think we kind of like to be a part, but being a Brit abroad is quite an interesting thing because I don't know about you, but I find Brits abroad tend to stick out.
Yes, absolutely. And
And
in fact, Americans abroad stick out, Brits abroad stick out,
there are so many
Europeans
bad
stick out.
stereotypes about Americans abroad that they kind of so many people do kind of live up to, like the shorts and the camera around the thing. And
Oh, yes. Exactly. But we have our own bad stereotypes as well, don't we? I mean, there's parts of Spain and Spanish islands that I might not visit because of not the Spanish, but because of the Brits.
oh, good Lord. Yeah, there's a place in France not far from where my parents live where they joke about there being so many Brits there that they drive on the left.
I can see it. Yeah, yeah. I think there's some Brits who got elected to a local council in Spain, and they didn't speak Spanish, so they had to have council meetings in English for them. That's worrying. I mean, most places I've been, although I stand out as a Brit, I like to learn, you know, what's going on around me, you know?
Yeah, when I lived in France, you learn French because that's you live in a country where they speak a different language, and you think that's a fair expectation.
Yes. And again, someone pointed out to me, so going to America, you don't have to learn the foreign language, but that can be kind of subversive. It can feel you don't have to do anything, when in reality there is a difference in culture. And if you want to retain your own culture, it has to be, quite deliberate, right?
I think so. There are all sorts of things that if we uh, that Americans do that are just alien to me as a Brit. I mean, and maybe it's we have different traditions depending on where you are. But like my family was always very structured with like it's drinks time at 6. You sit down
Mm.
together at dinner at 7 and stuff like that. And these things.
Yeah.
Whereas I married into a family where it's TV dinners in front of the television and stuff like that. And it's weird how you have to then navigate which traditions you keep and which you lose. And I do find the American ones kind of creep in because they're a little easier.
Well, of course, and after 20 years, one
Yeah.
imagines some would, right? I mean, I hesitate to ask, but do you drink coffee or tea?
That's interesting. I've never been a big fan of tea, I have to admit. So I've always drunk
Ah,
coffee. And one of the reasons I could never move back to England is because of the coffee. Because it's
all right.
instant coffee. I can't drink it anymore. And I mean,
Fair
I
enough.
don't have ridiculously fancy coffee, but I have, proper filtered coffee every morning and have it black and it's lovely. And yeah, I when I went to England, we had instant coffee. I was like, how do you drink this? How did I drink this?
Yeah. I made the change from instant coffee to French press coffee when I was in England, and once I made the change, I couldn't stay with it. That was the influence of a friend from Finland, actually. The Scandinavian countries are big on their coffee. I feel we've improved our coffee game, but I have to say, in terms of buying tea from a shop, I've had one really good tea from
Oh,
a shop since coming here. Um,
that's interesting. If we have tea, you can buy PG tips from sort of the exotic food section.
yes, yeah. So I've got a fair batch of Irish breakfast, English breakfast, and Earl Grey but I got it from the exotic shop.
It's funny, they're chocolate hobnobs as well. I mean, it's like, okay, if I'm going to pay $8 for a packet of biscuits, I'll get some of the chocolate hobnobs.
Yep. Yeah, so it's interesting. Again, we're sourcing all our foods. People have an idea that English food is really bad, which often I wonder, is that our jokes are being taken at face value? Is our food historically bad? I'm not sure. I like our food. I make it.
Yeah, I have to admit there are certain things that I love roast beef and Yorkshire puddings. My
Mm.
mother used to make very squishy Yorkshire puddings that I now like more than regular Yorkshire puddings, but that's one thing I really miss. It's like a
Yeah.
proper roast beef with Yorkshire puddings and Christmas dinner as well. It's like the
Mm.
because you have Thanksgiving, you have turkey on Thanksgiving, so you don't have it on Christmas Day.
Yes. Thanksgiving was an interesting one. You basically have to, yeah. with our household, we're having two Christmas dinners a year, basically, which I found very curious.
Yeah, and Thanksgiving is odd because I find there's one dish I never got, which was sweet potatoes with marshmallows on top, and you grill those, and that's my wife's like speciality dish, and I'm like, what the hell is that? Like, what is that?
Yeah,
That
I've
should not exist.
it's a curious mix of okay, the sweet potatoes, but they're not really sweet as marshmallows. That's an interesting mixture.
It is, and yeah, and then you've got the mashed potatoes and you've got the stuffing, and I'm like, every single thing apart from the turkey is mashed.
Yeah.
I like to have texture with my food. I like to be able to stab a potato or have a bacon wrapped chipotle or chipolata. That's it.
Oh yes, yes. That is curious. That is interesting. It's quite different, right? So, I've had a lot of Americans ask me if I celebrate Thanksgiving in England, which I mean, we celebrate. I don't know what to say to that, but that's on their own history, isn't it? But anyway, it's Harvest Festival. I think is the closest that we
Yeah,
have, right? But again, moving around the UK, I found that Harvest Festival being perhaps one of the dominating festivals of the year, or being non-existent, depending on where I was living. Um,
and I think with the circles you go in. So my grandfather was a chaplain, and then he was a vicar, and I grew up in like a church environment. So you'd have the harvest festival and go to church and sing your hymns and things. And then as soon as I stopped going to church, it's like that just ceased to be part of my life.
oh, right. Yeah, because it is a very religious festival, um, kind of being thankful for the harvest, essentially.
Yeah, which always it's quite a sensible festival. I like that.
Yes,
Makes
yes,
much
it is
more
good.
sense than running around after a rabbit and eggs that has something to do with.
That's a strange one. But talking of strange festivals, Halloween was quite strange to me. Like
That's
growing up, we didn't really celebrate it where I lived.
No, we didn't really. And I know it's got more and more, but I mean, it's such a big thing here. I mean, we've got, if you look outside of our house, we've got a skeleton and we've got gravestones and skulls and things like that. And I have the time of my life. October is such a wonderful time of year. And especially around here because it feels like all of the horror movies. Not most, but so many horror movies are set in New Jersey, and then
Oh,
it's
right.
got like
Okay.
the spooky trees and the beautiful fall weather and stuff, and it just feels so wonderful. And you've got
Ah,
haunted houses everywhere, so I love Halloween. It's like October is my favorite month of the year, and I think it is particular to living in because I think
mm,
technically we're on the cusp of New England. So
okay. If you went to back to Britain, would you take it with you? Is that something you take in your suitcase? Halloween.
I don't know. I don't think I would, just because I think it's something that would be so. I don't want to say use the word ostentatious, but I think it's because it's such a like you project so much when you like put the decorations there and
Yeah.
do that, and it's kind of I don't know how enthusiastic I'd be about that. I love being able to be part of it in America with no self
Mhm.
consciousness, whereas I think in England you might feel a bit self conscious about
True, true, yes, because there is a different vibe, right, to how we
it.
celebrate these things. Like even, I go to church, and so even just some of the hymns, they're the same hymns, but they're sung very differently. There's a different vibe.
Yes. Even the words. So, I mean, I'm not really a church person, but when we
Mm,
came here, we started going to an Episcopal church, which is really, really familiar because it's
yeah.
basically Anglican for American. Is that the same denomination you go to, or is it?
I'm very lucky. I've been going to a Church of England church here,
Ah,
on and off, on and off. Um,
but there are the subtle but significant differences.
yes, yes, there are.
Which
I had a
my
request.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I had a request a little while ago to do a deep dive into Church of England. So that's something that's on the back boiler. Seeing if I can arrange a real deep dive into what is it and what makes it special and different, especially from other European countries. Right, it's quite separate um, from Central Europe, Eastern Europe.
That is, and it's funny. I have to admit, a lot of our friends that we've made in America have been through the Anglican Church, and I'm not. I consider myself something which I think is uniquely British, which is kind of like an Anglican atheist. It's like you don't necessarily
Mm.
have any religious beliefs, but you enjoy the just the familiarity and the community of Anglicans. And I swear, I think 30% of people who are Anglicans are probably atheists as well. They just enjoy like what it is. It's wonderfully familiar.
Mm. And it's that concept of community, right? So you find yourself in a very different community, and that's something I'm interested in, really, like retaining Britishness in a different community. You've connected with other Brits in your community. Um, yeah, I haven't really done that here. I haven't found it yet. I
No,
mean, obviously,
it's
I've got a whole podcast on British culture, which I probably wouldn't be doing if I was living in the UK.
as I mean, the wonderful thing is you've had such an interesting experience having lived in other countries as well. So it's not just America. Because I loved living in France and bumming around Europe and things. And I remember knowing as soon as the first time I ever went to France, within like a couple of days, I was like, I'm never going back to England. I just can't.
Oh wow.
I like being a foreigner.
Mm.
But I never had the same experience as you. I mean, you were in Istanbul from a very young age, weren't you?
Yeah. Well, I went to Turkish Cyprus, so it's even, it's the remote place of a remote place in many, many ways. So yeah, this is like an unrecognized state in the Mediterranean. And so I was living in this place which has an economic embargo on it. It was really cut off from the rest of the world. So if I wanted to speak English, I had to find the nearest, 70-year-old. My parents were the young people, and I was a teenager. I wanted to talk to other teenagers. So that was very simple. I learned Turkish. um, but I say, in such a different environment, it made very clear I'm definitely English. I was the Englishman, right?
Yeah,
That's an identifying thing. As I walk through the village, it's not like there's any other. Certainly not my age. Um, so again, it becomes perhaps a defining characteristic. That's part of what you are. So as I say, as you said, when we go back to England, it's suddenly a very different feel. Of course, that's what
yeah,
everybody is.
absolutely. And England has these weird things. It's like I got bullied ridiculously for having red hair, and I tell people stories about it now, and it sounds ridiculous coming out of my own mouth. But I was like, I literally could not walk down the street in England for more than a day without someone slowing down and being like, "Oi, Ginger!" And like, I could not go to a pub without someone coming up and being like, "Hello, Chris Evans, how's Billy Piper doing?" And it's like, it was so weird. I loved going to France and then going to America because even though I was different, nobody would come up and accost
Yeah.
me like that. And it was, and yeah, you go back to England and that's just one thing. And also, I have a vaguely posh accent, so certain people you're going to meet are going to be like, "Oh, he's got a chip on his shoulder, thinks he's all this," and
Yeah.
then other people, it's it's very weird, and I kind of feel liberated from that living abroad.
The most unpopular place to have certain English accents is in England, in my
Yes.
experience. Like, I've never had someone complain about my accent in Saudi or China or America, but I've certainly had people object to my accent in the UK. Because it's our identifier of each other, right? It's a big part of our cultures. You can't judge people by how they look, but you judge them by how they sound. Although,
Yeah.
from the sound of it, you're
And
being
then in
judged by both.
America, people don't quite do that. Someone was watching Kingsman and they're like, "Oh, Eggsy, he sounds just like you." And I was like, "How dare you?" Because I
Uh,
mean, the whole point of Kingsman with Eggsy as a character was the thing, and I some of these subtleties are missed, but it is nice just to be like, I feel I get to be me.
hmm. Yes, exactly. So you found yourself in America. So you don't see yourself going back. You see yourself very much there. I'm very curious if you were to define yourself as a writer. You get to define words. Would you consider yourself an expat, an immigrant, a Brit abroad? Is there any label you'd give to yourself?
I think I would call myself an expat, which
Okay.
I think that's very interesting because yeah, a lot of people around here, it's almost like Little Mumbai because we have so many Indian people who they consider themselves immigrants, whereas I consider myself an expat, which to a certain extent is like that British pretentiousness, I guess. Like, I'm
But what
not
would
an
you say is
immigrant
the
to this
difference?
country.
Why does it make such a difference? What is the difference in your mind?
It's interesting. I think to a certain extent now I look at it, it's kind of like an ego thing. It's like if you're an immigrant, then you're assimilating with another place, whereas if you're an expatriate, you are like separating yourself from that place.
Term how you like, right? So a friend of mine was suggesting, well, if you want to integrate, you're an immigrant. If you intend to go back, you're an expat. Or maybe if you don't want the local passport, maybe that's one way to can we define ourselves by our paperwork, basically?
And that's an interesting. I When I got the chance, I became an American citizen just like that.
Okay,
I had been deported once before, so some part of it was the
good gracious.
yes. Everyone's
I
always
don't
like,
know whether I
"Wait, you
should
got
let that
deported?"
slide or if I can't.
So Yeah, I will admit, when I first came to America, I was hopping back and forth. I would play a little fast and loose with the visa things, which was
Right.
fine up until a few months after 9/11 when they were like, oh. And so I remember arriving one time in America. My then girlfriend, now wife, was waiting for me, and they were like, "You're going back home again." So,
Oh
yep,
gosh.
I flew there, and they flew me straight back. And I had four meals and two bottles of wine on the flights, and it was an interesting experience. But look, I get to say I've been deported. How many people do you know have been deported from America?
Good gracious. Okay. That's a tick on a bucket list which I haven't had yet.
You'll probably find millions of people who've been. I don't know. I know lots of people, but very few who've ever managed to come back.
Yes. Congratulations. Well, they must have been terrible at the time.
Yeah, it was not good, and it took sort of 5 years. And I would say if there's anybody who comes to America and would like to live here, I would definitely say go by the book, follow all the protocols, and get the paperwork right because they could make an awful lot of complication for you otherwise. But I always feel
Yeah.
like as much as I am painfully British, my heart is kind of American. I always wanted to be an American. I always wanted to be a cowboy and come to this amazing country that I think has this promise that maybe it doesn't deliver on of just, you can be yourself, you could make your fortune. And I don't think I would have become as successful as a writer in England. I think I'd have just been too self-conscious and too, you know,
Mm.
trying to conform.
It's that worry that you feel. It's the what the neighbours would think, what your the people around you would
Yes,
think.
I think so. I had a lot of people who are like, oh no, you can never. I think in Britain you have this weird thing of everybody roots for you until you get a little higher, and then it's like you get and it is a very weird British thing. I'm thinking of all the
Yeah.
celebrities who like, you get to a certain point, but then the tallest nail will always get hammered down. And there is you
Yeah.
mentioned fairness. There's a very much a sense of fairness about Britain, but I don't know if it's fairness or envy.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, that's an
Um,
interest. That's a very dark side of British culture, isn't it? Building heroes up and knocking them down.
Yeah, and there is I call it the neck curtains twitching. There is always this thing
Uh,
of peeking through, being like, oh, what are they doing? And it shouldn't be allowed. And I think in America there's this philosophy of, if somebody's doing something and it doesn't impact you directly, then they can do what they want.
okay.
Whereas I think in England it's like if somebody's doing something and you don't like the look of that, then somebody needs to put a stop to that.
Yeah. Okay, I can see that. And I'm wondering, you spent a lot of your life, most of your adult life is now in America.
I suppose it is actually, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and there are certain things that I realized, when I went back to France once, I remember sitting down in a restaurant and waiting 15 minutes for the waiter to come over. And of course, in America, 3 minutes, somebody would come up and be like, "Hi, my name's Debbie. I'm here to serve you." Whereas as it was in France, I was waiting that long, and the waiter came over, and the waiter was almost like, "How dare you sit at my table? Can't you see I have other things to do?" And and you get used to that. If you spend a lot of time in France, that's fine. But in America, you just have such these little things that are so different.
Yes. Yes, it is different. Yeah, I've noticed that about what server culture. I don't know how else to put it nicely.
Oh, and that's a weird thing with the tipping as well.
Oh,
So, and I know it's almost like waiters are subcontractors for the restaurant, and so you have to pay them a delivery fee from the kitchen, and it's
yes, yes, and it's gone up here in the last few years. That's extraordinary.
yeah.
Well,
And
extraordinary to my mind.
it is. My wife used to be a waitress at TGI Fridays, which is like a generic sort of chain restaurant, and she's short and bubbly and has huge boobs, so she did very well for herself with the tips. But it was amazing to see just a different attitude she had towards it because I've waited my fair few share of tables and things like that, but I never took it quite as seriously as that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the Yorkshire service, I love it, but it can be very plain and direct. Of what are the gluten-free options? You can leave.
Yes.
Good to know.
Our
Um,
gluten-free options are a taxi or Uber.
exactly. I was once in a Yorkshire restaurant with a very good friend of mine, who said to the waiter, "I don't really like what's on the menu. I'm vegetarian, and I kind of want something with cheese. Can you just tell the chef?" And I was so worried. I was desperately worried. I had no idea what was going to come. And they came with something extraordinary. It was generally something off the menu, vegetarian, lots of cheese. But he knew all of them, but hadn't told me he knew them. That was his little joke.
And that's another thing about when you go to a restaurant. It's like people will be like, "Okay, I'll order this, but I'll have it without the pine nuts, and I'll have the dressing on the side and things like that." Whereas in England, I think we have a culture of you just order what's on the menu.
Yes, yes, and as an expat in China, you order what you can understand. You're
Yes.
very sure what it is.
I was listening to Anthony Bourdain's audiobook, and he was talking about going to Japan, and it's like he would sit down and he'd look at other people's food and then be like, "I want that," because that's all he could do.
Fair enough, fair enough. And I was in what is old Canton. It's now Guangdong, but Cantonese food has a reputation. I love it. I have to say, I absolutely loved it. Um, not sure whether I should break out the awkward food stories at this point, but
That's one thing we don't really have awkward food stories in America because it's all fairly, deep fried. I would love to hear an
oh,
awkward food story.
I ordered a small.
Oh yes.
I got something as big as my head.
So I grew up, my parents, being as old as they are, it was like clean plate club. You had to clean your plate. And then, yeah, you move to America and you get your plate of food. And it's standard in America to package half of it up in a bag and take it
Yeah,
away. Whereas I was trying to eat it all. And I was like, oh
yeah.
my
No,
God, I'm
I've
dying.
I've gotten on board very, very quickly with taking half the stuff home. Good, that supper the next day taken care of. And as you mentioned, I've got quite a few suits that I've had tailored. I can't afford to change my figure. This is a key motivation. I got to get up, go for a run, not eat too much.
And it's very easy.
Yeah.
I've been pretty much the same weight now for years because I did intermittent fasting because that's the only thing that sort of keeps off because I got so fat. I got
Okay. Yeah. But it's a big thing. I feel this is a common thing for Brits coming to America that we need to be very careful about the food.
Yeah, because the food's fun. I just think around here it's nice because I like beer, so there are all of the craft
Ah,
breweries, and you can go and drink all of those, and you have all the pubs and the different types of food. I mean, there are some amazing Indian restaurants around here because they have so many Indian people in this part of New Jersey. But then if you like Mexican food, you've got Mexican. And I guess in London you've got all of these beautiful menu choices. But I remember when I went to Winchester with my then 10-year-old, it was like pie and chips, and that was kind of it. And everything shut down at 5 o'clock in the evening, including the
oh yeah.
supermarkets. And I was just, I had forgotten it was like that. And my son was just like, "Oh." It's like, what is this place,
Yeah.
Dad? Where do we go now? And I'm like, to the pub.
That stays open. Yeah.
Yeah. His first words when we arrived back home, he ran up to his mum and was like, Dad took me to so many pubs.
It seems to have a very different resonance in America to Britain, right? So if you took a 10-year-old to, say, a bar, which is supposed to be the American equivalent, that would have a very different feel from taking a child to a pub.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I grew up in England, kids weren't allowed in the pubs, and we used to sit in the beer
Oh,
garden
oh,
and eat cheese and onion crisps and drink Coke while my parents were inside.
oh! I was in some pretty rural places. I was surprised not to find a child behind the bar. But yeah, anywhere with a larger town, suddenly it was different rules, and I wasn't allowed to be in the. Oh, this just seems strange. Or there was a line on the floor where kids were allowed.
Yes, I because
That's
there was one pub in the centre of London I went to with my 10-year-olds, and they were like, "Oh, we don't allow kids in here," and then
mm.
they were like, "Oh, go on then," because there was no
I
one else in
bet you
there.
don't allow smoking either.
Oh,
Unreasonable people.
I know. I don't even smoke, but I'm offended on the behalf of smokers. I'm like,
Same here. I don't smoke,
yes,
but I kind of, for me, that's the smell of a pub.
yeah.
It's
And
all mixed together.
and I remember when I first moved to America and was sort of footloose and fancy free. It was kind of you wake up in the morning, you'd smell the cigarette smoke on you, and you'd be like, "Oh, I had a good night last night.
Exactly.
Now I'm
Yes,
going to get
it's.
everything dry cleaned."
Oh, yes, that would be nice. But yeah, no, it's very, very different, right?
Um, And it's so what are your plans that you still have to see and stuff like that? Because you're quite well. Did I see you got pictures taken in Stacey Sutton's house from A View to a Kill?
Yes, I've been to almost every location in America for A View to a Kill. Very, very pleased. One place I didn't go was Chinatown, which isn't in the film. They have an actor who's actually from the UK playing a CIA agent, Chuck Lee, who's Chinese American, just as a nod to that. It was funny. I was watching the film with my parents, and they're saying, "Oh, he used to be so famous. He was a TV star. He was in some show where he's Chinese and he's a detective." And I can't remember. And we were looking it up. His show was called The Chinese Detective.
It does exactly what it says on the tin.
Exactly. Said to be really good. But yeah, no, I love traveling around there. But of course, one of the strangest things is seeing City Hall in San Francisco because it's so familiar. Because if ever filmmakers want something set in the US capital, Washington, D.C., they don't want to fly all the way over because it's so far. So occasionally they just drive up to San Francisco and have it like blurry in the background and it kind of looks the same. Indiana Jones does that. So for me, it was as familiar from that as anything else in Bond.
Yeah, I used to do some lobbying down in Washington DC, and now I think about it, you're absolutely right. They look very, very, very similar, and they're on the same scale, which is
Yes, yes. So it's quite strange to see it as familiar, but not for what it is, but for what it's supposed to be in certain movies.
yeah. Oh, isn't that interesting? I didn't know that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So where else do you plan on going? Are you going to go to cowboy country or come and have a martini in New York?
Certainly, I'd love to see New York. I'd love to see Florida because I went there, but just to Disney World. Um, so I feel I didn't see Florida. I saw Disney World, and that was an interesting thing for me to see. Very much enjoyed it.
I've been to Delray Beach, which is lovely, but apart from that, Florida seems like very flat and it's all like a periphery of Disneyland.
Yes, yes. I haven't seen a crocodile there except in the zoo. So saw an alligator there. But no, there's no shortage of things to see here, right? I've just been up to Yosemite, and that was striking.
Oh, I bet. Oh, that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, because again, I mentioned that China has its shared public spaces, like in
Yeah,
terms of, I call them selfie parks. I've probably shared a lot of pictures of them because they're designed really for that. Like the city I lived in was largely made in the last 30 years, so everything has been made for that kind of thing. Um, Whereas here, there's dog parks and there's sports
yeah,
parks, but there's also the huge amount of nature, right? So America,
yeah.
again, it's big, but it's also not so heavily populated as China. So you do have vast areas of absolutely nothing. Um,
And I mean, it's funny. I've got quite a few books set around the San Diego area, but I've never actually been. But I was looking at the pictures of them, and these amazing, how different and alien it looks to my England, which is it's
yeah,
anywhere you go in England, you have certain things that are similar.
yes, exactly. And everywhere you go, you see people pretty well.
Yes.
Like even if it's just one or two houses, but you don't go for very rarely. I mean, maybe in some parts of Scotland you can drive for a long time and not see a house, but it's pretty unusual.
Yeah, I was in Wyoming last year, and I remember driving 3 hours and not passing a car, and it was
Yeah.
just like, it's like if I break down here, I'm dead.
Remember, my dad first came to America just on visit on business in the 70s, and he remembers driving through. I think it was Washington State. I'm not sure. But he was driving, and he was doing the map reading, and just saw these places marked, and he assumed they were towns or villages or something, but he hadn't seen any of them, and then suddenly realized it's so vast they're marking the individual farms.
Wow.
So yeah, again, I've heard of these things, but to see it in real life is quite different. Again, just like you see American movies and TV shows, but again, it's quite different to actually see it, right? Um, I can't go purely off The Simpsons, although it does take you a very long way.
So I grew up thinking that every single kid in America went to school in California because it's Saved by the Bell, and then they learned to
Uh,
drive in Georgia for a Dukes of Hazzard, and then you just went and like coasted around the northeast and sorry, the southwest in your Trans Am as Knight Rider.
oh wow, yeah. I mean, I'm seeing the A team everywhere I go here, right? I mean, in terms
Yes.
of just all the different landscape, looks like something from the A team. And when I was talking to somebody, in fact, it's the husband of Ladies Who Bond.
Oh, I
Uh,
love Jocelyn. I think she's wonderful.
She is wonderful, and her husband is absolutely wonderful too. And he was saying it always seemed funny to him. He was watching the TV show The A Team, and it's like they're supposed to be traveling all over the country, and everywhere they go just looks like this small part of California where they film it. And I was thinking it really sounds like our perception of Doctor Who.
Yes.
You can travel the whole of time and space, and he always ends up in Wales.
Yes. I think in Austin Powers too, didn't they have a line about that where he goes, "Here we are driving through England, which in no way resembles Southern California,"
Oh yes, I'd
and
completely forgotten that.
they stick like one red telephone box, and it's like England.
Exactly. I tell you, one thing I rarely notice about America is the flags.
Yes, lots of flags, and it's fun. I left about the time people were like, "Oh, the British flag has racist
Yeah,
connotations and stuff like that," which I think they backtracked a bit on that, but
yeah,
there was never the kind of like patriotism you have here.
yeah, yeah. I mean, just driving past any ordinary houses, have them out, and I've heard it. I still watch Have I Got News for You, right? That's one of my
Yeah.
windows into the UK. And some politician made a remark about, oh, he's the kind of person who'd have the Union flag outside his house, kind of dismissing him. And I thought, gosh, here, everyone would have it. I see the American flag, the California flag, the Mexican flag. There's a bunch of flags everywhere. I mean, it's not just that it's the weather for it, right? I mean, there's more to it than just it's sunny, get the flag out.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I know America has huge issues with race and stuff like that, but one of the things I think is the American flag. It is almost like an immigrant's flag because if you come to America and you make your life here, it doesn't matter where you're from, you become American. And I always say, to a certain extent, America is wasted on Americans because they don't appreciate what America means to so many of the people who came here to start a new
Yeah,
life.
yeah, I think that's a very valid point, and I wonder if I always hear these things and wonder, can we apply that to ourselves? Do we take our own country? Does Brits take Britain for granted? I don't know. I think a lot of Brits are very proud of it. So,
Yeah, That that is interesting. I'm incredibly cynical as well. I remember sometimes I read like the Telegraph or something, and you have this chap. Oh, it was a perfect British day, and I walked from church down the lanes and stuff, and I'm like, that makes me nostalgic, but also just, oh my God, you're ghastly. It's kind of that weird thing that you have where you're like proud of it, and also kind of like the cynical side of myself is almost dismissive of it.
that dark cynicism does seem to be a British trait. I'm told I'm not too bad myself most of the time, but I had an American colleague who's often mistaken for being British, and he once just said, "I'm not British. I'm just quite cynical as a person."
I get mistaken for being Australian a lot, and I think it's because I smile, and they're like they don't expect British people to smile.
Ah. I've I've not had that. I've heard of it as a thing. Brits going to America being mistaken for Australian. And I know that used to be a big thing in the 80s with Crocodile Dundee and all that.
Yes.
Like, it was such a big, yeah. Huh. That's very interesting. But most of the reports I heard were from the East Coast. Like, that's where most Brits I knew traveled to. Um, and
Because
deeply interested. Sorry,
there's
I'm
such a
deeply
lot.
interested in the idea of America as two different civilizations, East and West. I realize there's a bit in the middle too, but
Oh, it's funny though, because I was traveling around a lot last year and I went to sort of Northwest Arkansas. And I have to admit, I was being super pretentious. I was like, oh, I'm going to go and sample all of the Arkansas food and stuff like that. And we arrived, and the airport was a cowshed. I'm not
oh
even
wow.
joking. And so we walked through the cowshed, and then, yeah, it had Chili's and Applebee's and Domino's and Pizza Hut. And the only place that was like its own unique thing, I'm not even making this up, it was called Guns and Grinds, and it was a gun shop and coffee shop.
Wow.
And I was like, wow. But apart from that, it was just flat and everything was a chain. There was like no culture there whatsoever. And
I'm
it was
very
a very
curious.
affluent part of Arkansas because they've got Walmart and Tyson's Chickens. They call it the Silicon Valley of the Midwest. But I was like, this is there's not a lot here.
I'm very curious about this Guns and Grinds shop of whether the idea is that you're drinking your coffee whilst you're shooting, you drink the coffee before you shoot.
I don't know. Now, have you been shooting since you've been in America?
Oh yes, yes, that was a must do on one of my first trips. Yeah, that was
Yeah. Did you do any shooting when you did your youth, or
I
because you were in
mean,
the Navy?
yeah, and to come from a military family, so I'm very used to. I'm just used to the sound of it and so on. So I remember where my parents live is not so far away from an army base. So we woke up one day and we heard the high velocity rifles. And for my parents, it's just nostalgia. It's
Yes.
just most of their lives have been surrounded by this. So I guess I've got a touch of that. Yeah, I don't
Eh,
used to see them out and about. They're very restricted in the military, right? But
yeah. And it's funny. I mean, we don't have it so much in the East Coast, but there are certain places you go where people just carry guns, and I noticed that.
yeah, because I remember
So
going to France as a child and being surprised the policemen had guns.
yes, isn't that such a remarkable thing? It's like such a weird British, and I can understand that because British police officers don't want to be responsible for killing anybody.
Yes. Yeah,
Whereas
and
in
it's
America,
not been a huge problem for us, right? So if you're responding to a problem that's there, fine. But it's not. Gun crime hasn't been a massive thing in our country, very fortunately, I think.
it's weird. I don't think it's ever been a massive thing.
Yeah.
And I find it very odd when you look at certain countries that have the same density of guns as America. Like I think Canada has a lot of guns, and Switzerland has a lot of guns, and Switzerland has the issue of husbands shooting their wives, which is obviously not ideal, but it's still to no way the same extent in America. So I don't think it's necessarily the guns. I think there's something else about Americans' culture. Maybe it's
Mm.
the cowboy thing, or. But you're right. As a police officer, if you turn up at somewhere and you're carrying a gun, then it means there's much more likelihood that you will use your gun.
Yes. Yes, certainly. Yeah, and also people perceive you in a different way, right? I mean, the policeman I feel in an English country village is the man who helps an old lady across the road, and that's kind of one of his big, I've seen news stories of policeman responds to wild goose. Um,
Yes.
it's quite different from Florida man stories.
Oh, I know. And I mean, depending on your background, though, I know people who are like, they tell their kids, don't tell anything to the police, don't give your name, because if your kids are black, then you're worried about their interactions with the police. And
Yeah.
I find it very interesting because I have lots of friends who are police officers. I'm not making any political things, but if you look at the history of policing in America, it was originally the gangs that were meant to round up the runaway slaves.
Yeah.
And so you wonder if some of the issues the policing has in terms of race is a knock-on effect from that.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before, in terms of that being the thread. But it's quite different from, say, British policemen who, it's Robert Peel's Peelers and all that.
Yes.
That's why we
Oh,
say Bobbies, because it's after Robert Peel.
yep. And Peelers, and I mean, he created like the iconic thing with the hat and the uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, British police. They're your friends. They're your neighborhood
Yeah,
Bobby, and you go to him and your parents would be like the policemen who you go to if you're ever in trouble or something like that. Whereas
exactly. So
not
there's a
quite the
different
same.
perspective towards authority. Again, I think we're friendlier towards authority. We trust it more. There is a different history in the US towards authority generally.
I
Um,
think all Americans have this rebel spirit. I mean, I think that's why the COVID lockdowns and things. I
mm,
think to a certain extent you could push it to some extent, but then you couldn't go any further because I think
yeah.
even the most mild-mannered American would be like, "I'm not doing that."
Yeah.
America was founded on telling Britain to go stuff itself. So
Which I find interesting. I mean, we've talked about it a few times that turning point in history, right? Because I remember reading a very serious historian years ago who was saying, what if America had lost the revolution, then we would study it as the Second English Civil War. And then he
yeah.
started looking at all the different threads. George Washington looked at Oliver Cromwell as a role model for his early life and as a warning for a second life, which is why America has its checks and balances. And what was our
Um,
Civil War over? It was over taxation without representation to raise money for a navy. It's the exact same thing as the American Revolution. And a lot of them actually describe themselves in their early kind of writings as Englishmen. And
that's really. I always looked at the English Civil War as the reason why enough changes got made, and that's why England survived without a revolution during that
mm,
very messy period at the turn of the 19th century.
yeah, agreed, agreed. And it's in some ways we got our revolution in first before the other
Yes.
European countries, which again you go back to the medieval era and all the rebellions in the north. We still cling to Robin Hood as the, but it makes sense, right? It's
Absolutely, and because I would guess freedom has to be fought for eventually, but it's
absolutely.
but the non-compliance and the rebel spirit of America, I think, is a really unique thing. It's like I I always consider American culturally to be a lot like France because I don't know how familiar you are with France, but in France, like everyone is on the take. Everyone is doing things under the table. You get things done by knowing who to give the right fiver to and stuff like that. And I think to a certain extent in America, there is the ostensibly the system that works, and then there is this completely corrupt thing underneath. And if you want to get anything done, you got to know a guy who knows a guy and stuff like that. And having worked in politics and having gone and been a bit of a lobbyist, you can see this directly. So
Oh
I'm
wow.
completely cynical about politics because I'm like, at the end of the day, it is, the people become politicians so they can, get certain things, and
Mm,
companies go to those politicians and help them so they can get certain things, and it is all very self-serving.
wow. Yeah, it's like individualism, but it's the dark side of individualism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the counter to that is, again, I'm crediting Kane because he gave me the idea. He's super bright. But he was saying the English version of that is that we turn our virtue, like we like our rules, right? We like everything to be fair, but we can turn our virtue into a vice sometimes. Of even though I think I should help you and you think I should help you, and everyone around us thinks it's against. There's a bylaw, there's a local thing, and so I won't.
Yeah.
And so we are such sticklers for the rule that we shoot ourselves in our own feet, you know.
And that's interesting. I remember in France there was all these different things, and the way to figure it out was if you made yourself seem helpless and you appealed to the good nature of whoever was trying to help you, they would roll their eyes and be like "Le con anglais," and then help you solve your problem. But you
Uh,
just had to give them the fact that they could feel superior in helping you. They were being magnanimous in helping you with this, and as long as you took that approach, you could get whatever you wanted.
that's interesting because I once met a South African who was in France, and his French wasn't very good. It was just about good, but he wanted to speak English. But if he asked, in English, they wouldn't really be helpful. So he would ask them in Afrikaans,
Oh.
and then they'd switch to English, just realizing he was foreign and must, that was okay, but going straight in with English was not okay.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
there's the whole arrogance of like, oh, this is France, where does he not speak French?
fair enough. I mean, if
Which
anywhere in the world people should speak French.
yes, and I have to admit, I liked it. I think once you kind of understood that, like in Paris, a lot of people think, oh, Parisians are snooty, and I think Parisians are a lot like New Yorkers culturally.
Mm.
But once you get understand that, you can kind of admire it and kind of like it. It's like
Yeah,
there's that
I
that
mean,
certain disdain that you can navigate.
I've never been to Paris. Right? I've been to France a lot, and generally taken the advice that there's nicer bits of France to go to. So I've always found France a warm, welcoming, lovely place. But again, I'm from a rural place in the UK. I go to rural places in France. It kind of matches. It's like Berlin. Many people say is just not Germany. Um, if you want all the German stereotypes, go to Bavaria.
Where my parents live in France, everyone is so lovely, and it's like it's mind boggling. And then
Mm,
yeah, and in Paris, that's and Americans. I find when I went outside of the New York area, Americans were so nice and so welcoming. First time, I was like, "What's wrong with them?" I was in Pennsylvania. I think I was in State College, Pennsylvania, and I went to Walmart, and someone was like, "How are you doing today?" And I'm like, "I don't even know you." And you're asking me that question like you actually genuinely care, and it completely freaks me out because that's never
yeah.
happened.
Well, that might be one of the cultural shocks that I am having is strangers talking to me. I'm like complete strangers commenting on, "Hey, I like your shorts," or "Hey, I like your sunglasses," and I'm like, "What? What? You're first of all complimenting on my shorts. What's going on there?" Um,
Oliver Brown.
no, no, I got an American brand actually. Maybe that's why I like them so much. Do have the All Above Brown, but it wasn't that. It was J. Crew, which I'd actually heard of as
Yeah.
a good kind of Bond alternative. I just needed some shorts here. So.
I know, and that's a weird thing. They always say for English people coming to visit America, you should come with an empty suitcase and just fill it up with all the cheap clothes.
Star Wars
But
figures from Hamleys or
yes. So the one thing I find about America is the trousers. Sorry, I call them pants. Are so baggy.
yes.
Like the French ones are always super skinny, and I always end up ripping the backside. And the French ones are like, oh, sorry, the American ones are like baggy things. So like you need to have a British pair of trousers.
Yes. Okay, I can accept that. We need a Marks and Spencers here.
Oh yes, there's a place called Trader Joe's, which is kind of good.
Oh yeah.
That has Marks and Spencer's type things, but it's quite cheap. But Marks and Spencer's is terrific. Oh, I used to love going walking home through the pedestrian precinct in Winchester and buying yourself a nice dinner to heat up and a nice bottle of wine from Marks and Spencer's. You can get everything you want in
Yeah,
Marks and Spencer's.
absolutely. And I always judge an English city, how nice or not nice it is, by how big the Marks and Spencers is.
Yes.
So when I first went to Bradford, the Marks and Spencers was very small and largely hidden and underground. You kind of had to know where it was, and that spoke volumes about the city as a whole. When I went back recently, it had a huge Marks and Spencers right in the city centre, and again, the transformation of that city over the decade, it was a shock and a joy. Um, the whole city had changed.
So Winchester had yeah, it was a Marks and Spencer's and a Waitrose.
Oh wow!
That's
Ooh,
like terribly fancy.
it is a nice place. And Winchester is supposed to be where Camelot was. Is that right?
Well, I think it was, yeah. They've got the round table, which is a fake round table. I used to live in Cornwall, kind of the Arthurian thing, and they have this wonderful round table. It's not authentic, but Wessex was, was the capital of Wessex at one time.
Yeah. Huh.
So well, I'm a Wessex boy or a Wessex lad. I don't know.
The only way is
That
Wessex.
makes no sense. Yes.
Uh,
Which is funny because I haven't seen much of The Only Way is Essex, but The Only Way is Wessex is probably going to be a bunch of people who are like, do you know what? I really don't fancy going. And there's a bunch of people who stay in their house and watch television instead.
it'll be Gogglebox.
Yes.
Occasionally I go back and I find these TV shows that have become everyone talks about them, and suddenly I'm the one outsider who doesn't know what they are. And
I was explaining to my kids Rainbow with Loella
oh yeah,
Benjamin.
yeah, yeah,
Do you remember that?
yes.
Yes, and things. And Captain Pugwash. And my kids did not believe Captain Pugwash was a real thing. They thought it was made up. Especially, I mean, I don't know. Now I said it's like, oh yes, there's a character called Master Bates, and there was seen it, and it's like, was there really? Did I really grow up with that? It's like I look back now and I'm like, that's a trip.
Yep.
No wonder
No.
Jimmy Savile was able to get away with all of these.
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah. I introduced my in-laws to John Noakes, not in person, but via video.
Oh.
That'd be a dream.
And what did they make of him?
They couldn't believe it. Him going up to clean what Nelson's column with no, with what, a bucket and not much, maybe a rope around his middle.
And he was so unpretentious as well about that,
Yeah,
which I think is because in America it'd be like, I'm going to clean the windows, and you'd have all your safety equipment to make a big deal about it. Whereas it's like, going up the ladder to clean that.
exactly.
Completely not that accent, but
But the way he talks to the fella who does it every day, and he gives the man his due, and I really like that. Um, yeah. That's funny. We cling to our hometown partly through media, right? That's how Britain represents itself to the world, really.
yeah. And I'm a huge Doctor Who fan, but and it is. I made so many friends in America because Americans love Doctor Who, and if I go anywhere and speak, actually, my pretentious sartorial thing is I have the officially licensed coats. I have two of them from Doctor Who.
Really? Oh wow.
Yes,
Oh, wow. No,
they are
that's
splendid coats. That Matt, what is it? The one is a fake RAF coat, and the other one is one that Matt Smith wore, and it's a wonderful coat. And
oh.
sometimes you'll get people who come up and be like, "That's Doctor Who."
Ah, okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
It's like,
I think Tom Baker's scarf might grab me
oh,
someday.
oh, I've got one of those as
Oh, do you?
well. God, I like when I like stealth things. When I went to India, I wore a leather jacket, and the Indiana Jones top board and was like, "I just want to say that I admire what you're doing." It was very practical, though.
They are surprisingly. Okay.
Um, yeah, it's. I can even imagine going back to England right now. I think it's such a big impact. And my books that I write. Here we go. This is my latest about bikers. Where did that come from? Because it's so alien. It's a complete antithesis of my own upbringing.
That is fascinating. Yeah, yeah. So you can't imagine
And I
yourself
actually
anywhere else now.
my no, I think I might like to live in other places in America, maybe upstate New York, which is just beautiful, or maybe just a little bit from Pennsylvania. But there's a thing as a movie, I can't Keeping the Faith or something like that. Something I can't understand about people who don't live in New York is that you don't live near New York. It's like New York is such an amazing place. I would never want to live that far away from it.
Okay, okay. Sounds like it's very, very much your home now.
Yeah, I remember the first time I sort of came and saw things that just gave me chills because it's like I was so familiar to me in movies, and then
Mm.
you're like you're there. and it sounds like the movies, and it smells like the movies, and it's authentic, and it's got this rawness to it.
Wow. Well, that sounds perfect. I'll have to come and see it for myself sometime.
Well, absolutely. I hope you do, because I'll take you on the James Bond tour. There's go down to Grand Central Station and the oysters, and I think that story 007 is that there is no reptile house at the Central Park Zoo, but I think there is now a reptile house, or they have reptiles.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yes. There we go. It's fun. It's like it's beautiful Central Park, and you've got this nice little zoo, penguins and stuff like that. I'm just trying to think of all the other places that James Bond went to in that book.
Numerous jazz clubs, I think, are referenced.
Yes, and it's funny. My grandfather, who was a printer, he came to New York in the, I think, and we still have his membership, something called the Crane Club, and it's like it was so interesting for that. Where I think his grandfather being in New York at the Roaring '30s. Well, actually, that would be the Great Depression, I guess. But it was so weird to walk the same streets as him.
Well, thank you so much for telling me about your unique expat experience. It's been very, very different from other fellows I've been asking these questions of, and it sounds like you are almost uniquely happy where you are, that you found the right place, but still consider yourself very British and still are maintaining good traditions like a proper tea time.
Yes. I think I enjoy being British and living abroad. It's funny that the one thing that I like about James Bond, which I think maybe resonated with you, is like James Bond is always an Englishman abroad, and you've got these things. It's very easy to sort of follow that mold, because it's like a blueprint on how to be a foreigner abroad in a. So I think, I'm not quite as well dressed as you right now, but I am wearing a short sleeve shirt. So there we go. I consider myself more like Ian Fleming than James Bond, I think.
Okay.
Which is probably a terrible, terrible thing. So,
Wow.
when I'm dead of a heart attack in 10 years, I'll send you all my CDs.
That's my one thing I was saying. Please live like Ian Fleming.
Yes. Well, fortunately, I don't smoke, and I do occasionally exercise, and I'm 70 cigarettes a day is quite a lot. So one part of the Bond Fitness Challenge I couldn't keep up with. I assume we were doing the literary version of the Bond Fitness Challenge.
I was
so
assuming
like half a bottle of spirits and.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I'll draw us to a close here.
Yes, I'll talk for English. Sorry. Right.
Catch you later.
Cheerio.